When we think of the East India Company, most of us will bring to mind the Honourable East India Company, often known as John's Company, that operated out of Threadneedle Street in London, or the Amsterdam-based VOC, or the Verenigd Oostindische Company, otherwise known as the Dutch East India Company. Films such as The Pirates of the Caribbean, The Man Who Would Be King, or the TV series Taboo. We also have the horror story that surrounds the wreck of the Batavia. All of this has helped shape a current-day revulsion at these colonial ventures that are so far out of step with modern political thinking. Connections with slavery in Madagascar and Mozambique, corruption and commercial exploitation, particularly in India, do not help. And yet, these early corporations were the forerunners of today's commodity traders, and modern-day globalization is the natural byproduct of their activities. While these two long-standing corporations were of course seen as the most successful trading ventures to the Indies, they were far from alone. Many other state companies were established throughout Europe. Alongside the returning ships and profitable cargo auctions when returning home, there also sparked a fascination in the culture and skills of Indian and Chinese craftsmen and industrial and agricultural output. At the forefront of the smaller companies were of course the French, the Danes, and of most important to the Swedish venture, the Ostend Company, established by the Austrian Netherlands, now modern-day Belgium. Even the Americans were to attempt to establish factories later in the 18th century, following independence from Britain. Trade with India and China by sea had quickly followed Vasco da Gama's brave attempt to round the Cape of Good Hope and sail on to India in 1497, and the rapid rise of the number of Portuguese trading into that area that followed. Despite their European discovery by Magellan in 1521, the Spanish, under Miguel López de Legazpi, captured the Philippines in 1565. This ensured Spanish dominance in that archipelago. Following its incorporation in 1602 under the leadership of Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Dutch moved into Indonesia, the west coast of India, and Bengal, throughout the 17th century, rapidly expanding their trading in spices. It is estimated that the Dutch sent over 1 million men to the Far East during its attempt at colonial domination of the area. The British East India Company, first incorporated 2 years earlier in 1600 under the leadership of Sir Thomas Smythe, had its first voyage under the command of the veteran from the successful defeat of the Spanish Armada, James Lancaster. The following decades saw the establishment of outposts in modern-day Chennai in 1639, Mumbai in 1661, and most importantly in Kolkata in 1690. Other bases on the Malabar coast and at Surat followed. Equally important was the establishment of a factory at Bengkulu in Indonesia in 1685. However, it was only through their longevity that the British outdid the Dutch. The Dutch had largely driven out the rival Portuguese from the East Indies by the late 1600s and had taken the lead. However, following a series of Dutch wars in the 1650s and to 70s against the British, they sought to avoid conflict between the two rising European powers. The VOC focused on its own outposts or factories, with Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, giving control of much of modern-day Indonesia and the Malacca Straits, while bases in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, Formosa or Taiwan, and Thailand gave them a far greater network of bases that could also support by the Dutch control over Cape Town. The French were late to the party, not establishing their own corporation until 1664, and it would not survive the French Revolution, with the British driving them out of India during the 7 Years' War. The loss of Réunion and Mauritius in 1809 saw further territorial losses. Expansion in China was to come much later, with the British establishing a factory in Canton, or modern-day Guangzhou, in 1715, following behind the Dutch, who had established theirs back in 1686. A total of 15 foreign factories would go on to be established within this port, with the Qing dynasty carefully controlling foreign trade and restricting access to the hinterland. Macau, the Portuguese colony, was used as the principal port for refitting the ships, calling it Canton, with the shallow waters and difficult navigation up the river preventing the heavy merchantmen from loading directly from the factories. Instead, sampans and various types of Chinese junk were used to transport the goods down to the waiting ships at Whampoa, where the vessels would often overwinter, sheltering from the monsoon and typhoons that combined with strong tidal currents, making navigation in the waters somewhat tricky. The key development for some of the smaller European powers was to come in 1722, with the establishment of the Austrian-controlled Ostend Company. Over the next 9 years, it would send out 34 ships, predominantly to China. Unlike the Dutch, Portuguese, French and British, it relied on open trading in established free ports rather than building its own forts and outposts, thereby minimizing expenditure on manpower. The new model was to prove extremely profitable. Indeed, it was viewed by both the Dutch and the British as unfair competition, and hence both governments placed pressure on the Austrian government to shut down the company. The Danish attempted to revive their flagging Asiatic trading activities, utilising the Ostend model in 1730, opening a factory in Canton. Both the Ostend and Danish companies were to be of key interest to Sweden in the development of its trading venture, as it sought to limit the amount of capital leaving the country through payment for goods to the Dutch and the British. Before we look at the foundation of the Swedish East India Company, commonly referred to as SOIC, we must go back to England and a further trading company that was intrinsically connected to the British East India Company. In 1711, a new corporation was established called the South Sea Company that sought to benefit from the fisheries and fur trading opportunities in the Pacific and Southern Atlantic. The notorious South Sea Bubble of 1720 and subsequent stock exchange crash still survives as one of the most important lessons in modern-day economics. One of those who lost his fortune was a Scottish nobleman, Colin Campbell. The extent of his debts, caused by his stock exchange losses, forced him to flee Britain. He took on a role of supercargo for the newly formed Ostend Company, travelling out with their ships to develop close connections with the traders in Canton. Colin Campbell made a considerable fortune during these ventures, going some way towards repaying his creditors. The role of the supercargo was to act as the corporation's trader and negotiator on board the vessel, tasked with sourcing the ship's return cargoes. On board the ship, he was seen as the expedition leader, with only the running of the ship and the safe navigation falling to the ship's master. On the early expeditions, before factories had been established in Canton, there would often be several supercargoes on board, overseeing their calls at Malabar, Surat, Canton, or along the Malabar coast. Campbell also gave the company a distinct advantage, as his position was seen as key to the success of the early voyages. This was achieved by using his British connections, which enabled the establishment of a unique means of boosting profits by smuggling cargoes into Scotland. These smuggled goods were able to undercut the East India Company's prices, which, of course, were also subject to growing levels of taxation, particularly on tea. This commodity was quickly to be established as the most lucrative commodity for the China traders. It was the East India Company's pressuring of the British government that provided the final nail in the coffin that ensured that the Ostend Company would not be permitted to continue. With the winding up of the Ostend Company between 1727, when the Austrian Emperor suspended the company's charter, and the completion of the final voyage in 1732, Campbell needed a new employer. And other investors needed a potential opportunity to benefit from a new venture that could operate on a similar model. A chance meeting between Campbell with the Swedish trader Nicholas Sahlgren and a German-born civil servant in the employ of the Swedish government, Henrik Koenig, provided the impetus to seek the approval for a 15-year charter from the Swedish king. This would grant a monopoly in Sweden for trading to India and to China. So it was that on the 14th of June 1731, the first charter of the Svenska Ostindska Kompaniera, or SOIC, was granted by King Frederick I. The title page of the charter documents names Koenig as the principal sponsor. Between 1731 and the end of the fifth and final charter in 1813, the SOIC was to fit out 132 voyages to the Far East. This may appear small compared to the 4,572 voyages taken by the British East India Company between 1601 to 1833, or the even higher 4,785 voyages undertaken by the Dutch between 1602 and 1796, when the VOC collapsed due to the impact of the French Revolutionary Wars. At the time, Sweden was still recovering from years of war with the Russians, supported by Denmark and Norway, that had raged between 1700 and 1721 and caused much hardship in the country, with the loss of vast areas of land, most notably the coastal area in the Baltic that enabled Peter the Great to establish St. Petersburg as the new Russian capital. The Swedish government had recently passed the Navigation Act of 1724, which saw the introduction of cabotage trades as a means of protecting Swedish industry. This act was also designed to help boost domestic shipbuilding and provide a means of exporting iron, timber and tar in her own vessels. This period of recovery in Sweden became known as the Age of Liberty, following the regicide of the former autocratic ruler Charles. It was an early forerunner to the Age of Enlightenment, and the promises of the discovery of natural wonders following the rise of Swedish naturalists like Carl Linnaeus. Many of the supercargo's journals mention an interest in natural history, and some notable naturalists, including Andreas Sparrman, who later sailed with Captain Cook on his second voyage around the world, was known to have first completed voyages with the SOIC. The first charter, which ran between 1731 to 1746, saw 25 voyages, utilising 12 different vessels. Colin Campbell, as a director of the SOIC, led the first voyage to China, sailing as supercargo on board the Fredericus Rex Suecia, a 400-ton merchantman that had been built at Terra Nova shipyard. She would prove to be one of the company's most successful ships, completing 5 voyages, 4 to Canton and 1 to Bengal. The first voyage proceeded well. However, the ship was detained on her return journey through the East Indies, being taken into Batavia by a powerful Dutch fleet. Campbell had to use his best negotiation skills to obtain the release of the ship and her cargo, which was not harmed. The diplomatic incident that followed saw the company seek compensation from the VOC. This would be one of several such cases, as the SOIC sought to insist on its right for freedom to trade. Campbell was to remain in Gothenburg as a director until his death in 1757, and he made a substantial fortune, and all his South Sea Bubble creditors were repaid on his death. The second SOIC voyage, utilising a second-hand British East Indiaman called the Heathcote, sailed with a full team of 4 English supercargoes led by Charles Barrington, who had previously worked for the East India Company. Having left under something of a cloud, he was not well received by either the Dutch or the English when he sought to trade in Porto Novo, present-day Parangpate, in Tamil Nadu in southern India, a nominally Portuguese-controlled free port. A factory was established in the port, and trade goods were stocked, awaiting the return of the ship, which had proceeded up the Bengal coast to obtain further cargo. The factory in Porto Novo was seized by the French, and all the goods sourced by Barrington were seized, while he had to flee to evade capture and being handed over to the English. With the ship's attempts to gather cargo in Bengal less than successful, this voyage proved far less profitable and turned the SOIC towards focusing on the more lucrative trade in China. More legal action was commenced against both the French and the British government, with the British footing the bill to cover much of the voyage's trading losses. As a result, a treaty was agreed between the Swedish king and the British. A copy of this is still held in the National Archive, complete with this incredible seal. While the British tolerated the SOIC's freedom to trade, we can see from the East India Company's archives, now held at the British Library, that corporate espionage was alive and well. Details of ships' manifests and ships' sailing dates were notified by local port agents and sent back to Threadneedle Street. During the first charter, 4 SOIC voyages were lost, including the flagship, the Gotheborg, which was wrecked just outside Gothenburg on her approach to her home port on her 3rd return journey in 1745. Many commentators have speculated that, given the ship struck a well-known and charted rock just outside the port, that the loss was an insurance job. The fact that much of the tea cargo loaded on board had already been smuggled into Britain may also support this belief. Nevertheless, much of the ship's cargo was salvaged and sold in the port, and the incident was a simple pilot's error. The fact should also be considered that, having survived 3 voyages already, the vessel is likely to have been past her prime, with the ravages of the Southern Ocean and teredo worm from the East Indies likely to have significantly weakened the vessel's timbers. On her outward bound voyage in April 1741, during the early years of the War of Austrian Succession, the same ship Gothenburg, under her master Bengt Askerbaum, had been boarded by the crew of HMS Bideford. She was commanded by Captain George Forrester, the 6th Lord Forrester. You can see the ship's Admiralty plans here. 30,000 pieces of 8, the property of Francois Castanier, a Paris merchant, were taken. The National Archive still holds the court papers relating to the seizure. The evidence submitted is very detailed. The prize court deemed the silver to have been rightfully taken due to the state of war against the French. The ship was allowed to continue after the cash was removed from the vessel. 1741 saw Sweden resume her wars against the Russians to try and regain the territory lost during the previous conflict. This led to 2 seasons of missed trading opportunities, with few vessels sailing in 1743 and 44. However, the war ended with the Treaty of Abo in 1743, with Sweden losing yet more territory in Finland. In 1746, a second charter was agreed, lasting for just 10 years. 35 voyages were undertaken, utilising 13 ships, of which 3 were carried over from the first charter. Only one of the ships was lost, the Prince Frederick Adolf, lost in the South China Seas in 1761 on her outbound journey. It was during this charter that the true height of the success of the venture would be reached. In 1750, a new headquarters building was constructed on the waterfront in Gothenburg. The building still stands to this day and is now the City Museum. China was becoming the height of fashion, and while most of the tea cargoes were still being sold to Britain, the interest in Chinese silk, imported Chinese furniture, porcelain and artwork proved very popular domestically. The Queen's Palace at Drottninghold had a China house built. We can also see that the famous naval architect Af Chapman, who was to design many of the Indiamen sent out for the company, had a room in his house decorated with dozens of paintings of Chinese junks, sampans and other vessels. These must have been brought back to him by the various ship's masters from Whampoa, Macau and Canton. The third charter was to become the longest in the company's history, being granted for 20 years and running from 1766 to 1786, and this would prove to be the final charter not impacted by war. 10 ships, including 3 from the second charter, undertook 39 voyages. The amazing thing about this charter was that not a single ship was lost, and the Af Chapman designed Kronprinz Gustav was to complete 6 successful voyages, a sure sign of the improved build quality and the technology being employed at Swedish shipyards to ensure better constructed ships. However, profit margins were starting to be impacted by the increasing activities of the British, who were in their ascendancy following the retreat of the Dutch and French from India. The lowering of the tea tax also impacted the benefits of smuggling into Britain. Documents held in the National Archive that you see here detail the lengths custom officers in Scotland were going to keep a close eye on the trade. The fourth charter, in 1786, whilst also granted for 20 years, was to be badly impacted by the French Revolutionary Wars, and to another rather indecisive 2-year war with the Russians between 1788 and 1790. The latter included some of the largest sea battles ever fought under sail in the Baltic, including the Battle of Hoogland in 1788, the Battle of Revel and the Battle of Viborg Bay, both taking place in 1790. The conflict was to conclude with the decisive Second Battle of Svenskund the same year. This Swedish victory ensured the ending of the war without further Swedish territorial losses. As a result of the conflict, the Fourth Charter was only to undertake 32 voyages, despite having 12 larger vessels. What is interesting with the Fourth Charter is the resurgence of trading with India, with 10 of the voyages calling at India, reversing the trend of avoiding the country that had been seen throughout the Third Charter. There was one further shift from the traditional model seen. In November 1788, a London-born Canton merchant operating outside of the East India Company monopoly rules as a fur seal trader visited Sweden. Some of you may recall my earlier talks on Nathaniel Portlock, James Colnett and George Vancouver, and here our tales overlap. John Henry Cox obtained from the new Swedish king, Gustav III, permission to trade under the remit of the SOIC on the Alaska and Northwest Pacific coast in his armed brig, the Mercury. He also obtained a letter of marque to act as a privateer against the Russians. The strange thing is that the letter of marque required the ship to be renamed the Gustav den Tredje. Despite this requirement, the vessel was always referred to as the Mercury. When travelling out to the Pacific, the ship passed the island of Tubuai in August 1789. It is here that our tales crosses with one of the most well-known tales in maritime history, for it was here that the Bounty was anchored and the mutineers were hiding. The Mercury sailed past without stopping, but on arrival at Tahiti, they heard about the Bounty voyage and of her returning to Tahiti for supplies without Captain Bligh. John Cox traded profitably on the Pacific coast and returned to Canton to sell his furs. John's company refused to grant the ships permission to land, despite his Swedish papers, but the furs were sold at a good price. Sadly, Cox died a few months later in Canton, and the SOIC did not repeat its fur trading venture. Despite the expansion of trading activities, the board of directors found themselves suffering from growing financial problems and cash flow issues. This was not helped by the relaxation of tea duty in Britain. Rising insurance costs, coupled with the loss of 4 ships, with 3 being wrecked. 2 more were unable to complete their voyages due to structural problems, with the Westergotland being captured by the British off Cape Town in May 1801. You see here one of the captain's letters to the Admiralty. As well as this, the Gustav Adolf had to be sold in England in 1797. These factors resulted in the SOIC facing bankruptcy by the end of the charter. The SOIC was not alone. The Dutch VOC was to fail in 1797. This was due to a combination of unsustainable debts, the losses faced by its navy at the Battle of Camperdown in the same year, and its failing overseas possessions, most notably with the capture of Cape Town by the British in 1795. The VOC was also facing endemic corruption, with its supercargoes and ships' captains always seeking to benefit from private trade. John's company faced similar problems, and yet the SOIC somehow managed to avoid this. While some private trade was permitted for all crew members, it was never undertaken at the detriment of the wider company interests. In 1806, there was interest in trying to obtain a fifth charter. However, with a weak domestic economy, the continuing Napoleonic Wars, and a rapid reduction in profit margins on the principal tea cargo, it could not get off the ground. When combined with high insurance costs, the risks were just too high, and few were willing to pledge their capital. In May 1809, the assets of the company were handed over to the creditors for disposal, including the office building in Gothenburg. These also included 5 still serviceable vessels that had safely returned to Gothenburg throughout 1805 and 1806. The largest of these was the 956-ton Vasa, which had only completed a single voyage. William Chalmers, one of the last directors of the SOIC, appointed in 1786, continued the Scottish connections with the company. He had spent 10 years as SOIC factor in Canton and Macau, and in his last years worked hard with the creditors in Gothenburg to try and recover the finances of the company during the final years of operation. However, he was unable to save it. He would die in 1811, leaving much of his remaining, albeit far diminished, fortune to hospitals in Gothenburg and in Manila. His name still lives on in the Chalmers University of Technology in Stockholm, who also benefited from his legacy. At its height, the SOIC proved one of the most successful and profitable of all the East India trading companies. This can largely be put down to its business model and not seeking to overextend its reach. However, the focus of the China trade was critical. The company generated great wealth for many of its investors throughout 3 of the 4 charters, and after the final shareholders' meeting in May 1813, the formal closure of the company took place when the final stocks were sold, and all creditors were paid off, and a final dividend was paid. Overall, it is believed that within the 82 years of its operations, it contributed between 2 and 5% of Swedish gross domestic product. The unique business model involved selling Swedish industrial output, hemp, timber, tar and iron, in Cadiz, or later on in Ostend on the outbound journey. It was in these ports that the goods were converted into silver bullion, which, until the start of the opium trade, was the sole currency accepted by the Chinese. This gave the company a unique means of bringing economic benefit without stressing the local economy in Sweden. Indeed, the company was strictly forbidden from carrying currency bearing the king's head. It was due to this important role in recovering the economic fortunes of Sweden in the 18th century that, after the losses of multiple wars, that renewed interest of the SOIC came about in the late 1980s. It was at this time that the rediscovery and excavation of the wreck of the Gothenburg took place. Situated just off the entrance of the city that shared its name, it had laid undisturbed for over 100 years. The original Gothenburg was an 833-ton merchantman that had been built at Terra Nova shipyard in 1738. As mentioned earlier, she sank just outside the port on a well-charted rock on the 11th of September 1745 on her return journey from China. A scientific excavation was started in 1985 and continued through until 1994. It was the incredible finds from the wreck, bottles, shards of ceramics, complete tea sets, and other more unusual cargo fragments, such as ingots of zinc, pepper, spices, and of course tea, that proved most interesting. It was these discoveries, alongside the successful building of the replicas of the Endeavour in Australia and the Batavia in the Netherlands, that inspired a group of those involved to start fundraising required to build the replica of the Gothenburg. Work commenced in 1994 on preparing a shipyard on a derelict site near to where the original ship had been built. It was named the Terra Nova Shipyard, and over the next 9 years the ship took shape, being launched on the 6th of June 2003. Her figurehead was carved by our good friend with an Oxfordshire connection, Andy Peters. Since that time, the ship has retraced its namesake's voyage to China and back, and toured throughout Scandinavia and the Mediterranean. I was lucky enough to sail on board the ship from London to Bremerhaven during the ship's last full year of active sailing. Sadly, it looks like she will now be restricted to being a museum ship back in her home port in Gothenburg. I therefore count myself very lucky to have experienced sailing on what is one of the last wooden-built tall ships during her final years of sailing. Sailing on board requires a bigger crew than most modern tall ships, and teamwork. Everything is heavy, covered in tar, and the scale of the yards is just incredible. The 3 watches, when alone, can struggle with the hoisting of the huge topsail yards, but the braces and smaller sails can be easily handled. 2 of you are needed at the helm in calm conditions, and this can be increased to 4 or even 6 when entering harbour or in heavy weather. Keeping the ship clean, scrubbing the decks every morning with linseed oil soap, and regular maintenance jobs in the rigging, caulking, sail repairs, or, of course, painting and tarring the rig. Keep all hands busy at all times. There is also work helping out in the galley and the regular safety inspections around the ship, taking you through the engine and underwater compartments, checking for leaks and issues to be reported to the watch officers. Overall, it is a rewarding but hard life, and particularly in the crowded mess decks, where you sling your hammock with no privacy, bumping next to your neighbour as the ship rolls. It certainly shows how tough the original crew must have been. The original ship sailed with over 120 men. Today she has 18 professional crew and up to 60 voyage crew. On average, throughout the SOIC's trading life, over 10% of the crew would not survive due to scurvy, typhus, or other tropical diseases, especially for those ships calling in ports prone to malaria such as Batavia. However, the money and opportunity for adventure must have been a strong factor and remains the key attraction to any roving adventurers even today. Luckily, I didn't get scurvy. Thanks for listening.